You, Chantal, and then take away, please.
Thank you very much, Sung Lim. I just want to add, I agree very much that it's important to accompany any land acknowledgement with action. And so please do, as Sung Lim suggested, look at what you can do to contribute to the fight against colonialism in the Canadian state. But I'll just add that I am speaking to you from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg in what is now known as the capital of the Canadian state, in Ottawa. So I'm going to start by saying that I think people generally know Marx and Engels as people who came up with a powerful takedown of the capitalist economy, how it's fundamentally unjust, destructive, and exploitative, and prone to crisis and failure that gets passed down to the most vulnerable in society. But I think what most people know less about is that what Marxism actually contributed to most for us in the present day is a very real understanding about how capitalism also produces a force of liberation from within itself that is capable of ending the capitalist system and replacing it with a fundamentally different kind of society. And I think this part of Marxism is less known and understood, mainly because of the way Marxism got somewhat co-opted by the very different politics of Stalinism and Maoism on the one hand, and on the other, the way that the very word socialism became equated with social democracy and electoral parties like the NDP. Both of these political traditions are about change, social change coming from above, by an elite, not from the mass of the population themselves. And even the more you look into the actual history of Stalinism and Maoism and social democratic parties as well, even the change from above that they offer doesn't look like what real socialism should look like. And I would say go even further and say that the Marxism that we might learn about in school, in college, or university has a way of celebrating the amazing critique that Marxism poses to social conditions and to market economics, but doesn't emphasize the tool that it gives us to be activists or revolutionaries in the here and now, or to challenge class society itself in a real way. I myself read a lot of Marx in school, but the way it was taught was usually very different from the way I was learning to read Marxism and learn about Marxism as an activist and a revolutionary socialist. So that's sort of the lens we want to bring to Marxism in this day school today. I think also what people know even less about is that Marx and Engels themselves were activists in their own time, dedicated not only to a theoretical understanding of capitalism, but to organizing in a variety of movements that challenged aspects of the society that they lived in. Because they understood that those social movements were key to not only making important concrete change in the present, but also to changing people's thinking about what is possible, and especially to changing how working class people can come to see themselves as the makers of history through their own individual and collective experience of struggle. So Marx and Engels edited and wrote for a newspaper that was critical of the current regime in Germany. They studied and wrote about immediate struggles of the day across Europe, both worker struggles and struggles against oppression, of the Irish people, of Jewish people, of women, and about the growing brutality of colonialism in the global South. Engels witnessed the brutality and poverty of the Industrial Revolution in England, about which he wrote a scathing critique and a lot about child labor. Just one quote: "It is unpardonable to sacrifice to the greed of an unfeeling bourgeoisie the time of children which should be devoted solely to their physical and mental development, to withdraw them from school and the fresh air in order to wear them out for the benefit of the manufacturers." But it took the young Marx and Engels a while to come up with a way to connect a critique of what was so obviously wrong with the new capitalist society at the time and sympathy with the oppressed to a concrete way to challenge it in the real world, not just at the level of ideas or sympathy, but action. And they themselves started with all the questions about what was fundamentally wrong. They had facing a fairly newly entrenched capitalist class at the time that, along with the promise of unprecedented wealth and innovation, was also creating even more economic disparity. a growing social alienation with the breakdown of old social connections between the poor and semi-agricultural societies in favor of massive, rampant exploitation of labor in fragmented towns and cities with social norms that were unapologetic about segregation of the working poor and child labor and horrific working conditions, disease, and squalor. And all of this was following the European Enlightenment, an era of grand debates about reason and justice, and even revolutions about democracy and liberty that left out the big question of economic justice. The French Revolution in the 1970s had triggered a series of revolutions and uprisings against class injustice, exploitation, land theft, and slavery, which included the Haitian Revolution in the middle of the French Revolution, in fact, that was led by the great Toussaint Louverture against slavery. There was also around this time the revolt of the Inca leader Tupac Amaru on behalf of both indigenous and Black people in Peru in the early 1780s. These struggles were quite important in terms of an impact on ideas and seemed to present a time of promise for universal rights. But at the same time, there was also a retrenchment into a view of how political stability and the power of the market could set societies free. The whole experience produced the young Marx and Engels, trying to figure out what this great possibility of change that millions had experienced could mean beyond the limits that reappeared soon after. Marx and Engels were already grappling with an understanding of what drove change in human history even before this relatively new revolutionary period. They concluded there's a pattern in history where economic and political change is produced, but then either stagnates or is actually pushed backwards. But the starting point is not just the progress of thought and ideas or lack of progress of ideas, but the interaction of real individuals through their real social activity in the production and experience of their material conditions of life. Marx started looking by looking at this in terms of what makes us human, our drive as a species to come up with increasingly intelligent and creative ways to collectively solve problems of survival, but then how our own solutions over time have created new barriers to supporting all humans equally, because our collective solutions have given rise over and over to societies divided into classes, giving decision-making power to a minority. Up to the new era of capitalism, this was the best way to manage the struggle to provide a surplus of food against the constant scarcity of food. Marx started by looking at this reality in hunter-gatherer societies and traced it all the way through to all the various class-based societies that humans have lived through. And through this, told a story about how actual societies have changed. And from that came a method about how they can continue to change. The key is about understanding the social relations of production. Humans have evolved to be natural laborers. We think and work to transform the world around us, but in a fundamentally social way. But the relationships between individuals and how we understand our connection to collective society are determined by the material constraints of producing in a certain way that we inherit historically. So the secret to understanding our society and ourselves is understanding who controls the means of production: factories, mines, energy sources, but also industrialized agriculture, everything that allows the economy to continue and produce, and also all the ways this production is distributed through the labor that it relies on for distribution: trains, trucking, shipping, etc. Different classes historically arise when the direct producers have been separated from the means of production, which become the monopoly of a minority. So for modern capitalist society, this happened in a variety of ways, but the one that Marx seized on as a clear example of what was going on fundamentally in this process was the enclosure of the commons, common land that people who might have had not the best existence in terms of having to be, agricultural laborers for the owner of land, but they would also have some access to common land that they could use for their own purpose, for their own subsistence. These were closed off and cut off to those who would become the future working class proletariat, because it was necessary in order to create conditions where people had nothing to live on except their own ability to work. And it was something that came about during the rise of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism in Europe. Not without struggle, but it is what took place. And so this was a really key first example of land theft within Europe itself between classes that was at the same time happening abroad through imperialism and colonialism in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, with the addition of slavery and indentured labor. But it was part of a general process of separating the vast majority of any way to subsist, even on the margins, other than to sell their own ability to work. So this was the first big game changer for Marx and Engels, understanding that for the first time in human history, a class society had created a situation where the vast majority owned nothing of the means of production. The second big game changer for Marx and Engels was understanding that the new system of capitalism actually created an objective position of power for this majority inside the system, because the new system relied on the collective exploitation of working people as a whole, and consequently gave them the ability to shut it down through a collective refusal to work. And all of this was coupled with expectations about rights, democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity, that was not trickling down to the majority. This and the collective nature of work and exploitation was contributing to what Marx and Engels could see was, for the first time, not just a class in itself, but something that could be a class for itself. There were many, many inspiring rebellions of slaves, serfs, and peasants before this, but this new situation where laborers were driven to fight back collectively in a more conscious way, conscious of their long-term collective interests, this was a new thing, which shaped Marxist theory fundamentally about what might be possible. And in their time, Marx and Engels wrote about the immediate worker struggles that they began to see emerging spontaneously all over Europe. They studied their dynamics and appealed to these examples to argue for the need for a fundamentally different economic system. During his time in England, when Engels was looking at the emerging ravages of the Industrial Revolution, he also witnessed the Chartist movement. There was a movement called Chartism. It was the first mass working class movement in history to that point, and it got its name from the People's Charter, which demanded really basic democratic reforms to remove some power from the propertied class. And yet the question of what kind of political system was necessary to fundamentally change the economy, not just reform it or make it better, was a bit of a mystery until the truly big game changer that Marx and Engels witnessed, an unprecedented uprising that didn't just challenge economic exploitation, but the political power of the elites. And this was the Paris Commune of 1871. At that time, workers spontaneously took over Paris in a revolution within a city. And this is a whole story in itself that I don't have time to describe in detail, but it was an important moment that sent a signal that this new economic system of capitalism had created a real force within itself to create a more just society. Marx learned from the experience to come up with the missing piece about the political state in his theory of revolution, and he wrote about it in an amazing political pamphlet called The Civil War in France. He wrote that we could now see that working people can't just take over parliament or the rest of the state machinery that had grown up to protect private property and the political status quo, but in fact had to replace it. And the Commune had put into question not only the role of the police that we are still challenging today, but even the larger state. Marx wrote, from the very outset, the Commune was compelled to recognize that the working class, once come to power, could not go on managing with the old state machine. That in order to not lose again its only just conquered supremacy, they must, on the one hand, do away with all the repressive machinery previously used against itself, and on the other, safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any moment. So a more radical form of democracy than had been seen. And so Marx wrote about the Commune to celebrate the courage and ingenuity of the ordinary working people of Paris who were taking their own destiny into their own hands, but he also wrote about it to insist that it uncovered an important lesson for future struggles. He continues in this pamphlet to say that except on the condition of the economic emancipation of labor, the communal constitution, which was about incredible democratic rights, would have been an impossibility and a delusion. The whole thing was quite amazing at the time, that no elected official would be paid more than anyone else, could be recalled immediately. But Marx was saying that the only reason that this was possible was because of the economic emancipatory potential of working people and what that represented. The political rule of the producer cannot coexist with the perpetuation of their social slavery. The Commune was therefore to serve as a lever for uprooting the economic foundations upon which rests the existence of classes and therefore of class rule. With labor emancipated, every person becomes a working person, and productive labor ceases to be a class attribute. I love that quote. Every person becomes a working person. the Paris Commune was only the first in a series of new state structures created by working people in the heat of revolution. And again, each of these is a story in and of themselves, but the story at this point is how they recur and have recurred. In Russia in 1905 and 1917, they were called Soviets. The history of what happened afterwards and the denigration of that experience into Stalinist politics is something we can discuss in the discussion. But over and over again since that time, workers' self-activity have produced their own state structures in a number of other places. In Chile in 1972, at the time just before the coup by Pinochet, where they were called cordones. In Iran in 1979, where they were called shoras, before that revolution also was co-opted. And even twice in Canada, from the strike committees set up in Winnipeg in 1919, the general strike that came to operate city services and deliver food and necessities without managers, to the experience in Quebec in 1972, where 9 towns were taken over by Quebec workers during an illegal wildcat strike in 1972. All of these are real examples of the fact that workers under capitalism don't just have the power to withdraw their labor, but also the power to restart their labor under their own control. And that this is the key to getting rid of capitalism and creating a path towards true human liberation. So understanding these relations of production that turn some humans into cogs in the machine without control over their own ability to work meaningfully was really key to not only understanding how to change the capitalist economy, but how to change the ideas of humans, both individually and collectively. It's connected to the whole history of how ideas and societies have changed throughout human history, but how it is especially true under capitalism, which creates conditions for people whose work is exploited to be more conscious of making social change in their own names, rather than just following others. So then, why do most working class people often think capitalist society and the economy can't change to be more equitable or different? Many of those who say they don't think of themselves as socialists will answer that it's not because they don't identify with ideals of social justice or because they think we need the market or anything like that, but they don't see a way that we can get rid of private property easily or in the short term. The answer is often not that things shouldn't be different, but that they can't be. Not because capitalism is effective, but because it seems insurmountable or even unchangeable. And this is because the dominant ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, who keep a huge monopoly on education, on all sources of media and information. And it's not because these ideas make more sense, but because the ruling class controls most of the things in society that shape our ideas. Not completely, obviously, but to a large extent. And then we come back to the whole question of what drives historical change. Ideas themselves don't make history. People's place in society shapes their understanding of themselves and of society. But at the same time, human societies have changed enormously, and ideas have played a role in that process. This is why Marx found it really important to study the whole process of historical change prior to capitalism, all the previous revolutions and uprisings, to understand what can bring working people under capitalism into direct conflict with those dominant ideas of the ruling class and convince them that real change is possible. And there were 2 basic conclusions. Social reality in all class society is contradictory, and people are not just passively molded. Daily experiences often contradict the official ideas of society that we receive. Struggle is a necessary and inevitable part of social existence, and struggle itself holds the possibility of changing ideas in a deep way, even when it's not a totally self-aware process from the beginning. The way Marx summed this up was to say that people make history, but not in the circumstances of their own choosing. And not always consciously, but in the process, they change themselves and their way of thinking. So how do we change the social means of production to something different? Marx argued, and I agree, we need a social revolution based in workplaces to change the social means of production. But there's a watchdog over this, and that exists outside the workplace, and it is a wolf, sometimes in sheep's clothing, the so-called democratic state, parliament, republican, constitutional monarchy, whatever form of the capitalist state exists. It is wedded to the protection of private property. And the question has to be, who owns the state? The key to overcoming this confusion lies in the method Marx developed to understand how thinking changes. Socialism is not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for, and emerges through movements for social change. But it's not automatic, and it's not a clear process. It takes conscious reflection on exactly what kind of social change we need and how it's possible. So the question is how working class people can become collectively conscious of our goals and power, not just as individuals, but as a class. And capitalism creates the conditions for that, for the social relations of production to be fundamentally different. But Marxist theory of history argues that it is not inevitable. It can end in a bad result. It can end in the mutual destruction of fighting classes on either side, which can result in stagnation of productive forces and which will continue to disenfranchise the majority from power, impoverish the majority of society, or worse, lead to accelerated war, conflict, and social decline, and now, in fact, climate destruction. The Marxist revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who was writing in the early 20th century, had a really important way of putting this challenge that we face. How does a people or a class become fit to rule in their own name? Only by fighting to do so. Only by waging their struggle against oppression by those who tell them they are unfit to govern. Only by fighting for democratic power do they educate themselves and raise themselves up to the level of being able to wield that power. There has never been any other way for any other class. So I'm going to bring this to a conclusion with a few words about what this teaches us about revolutionary strategy today. And I really want to hear your comments and discussion about this. Because the real question is, how do peoples, communities, movements who are learning through struggle help us get to the real question of economic and political power? Movements are really key, but they're actually only one sharp end of a larger class struggle that is the only way to not just keep making gains, but then continually get pushed back. And so the role that working class power can play within mass social movements is really key. Palestine today is an obvious example of this. The genocide in Gaza has given birth to a movement with tremendous revolutionary potential. It's an intifada of both Palestinians and non-Palestinians. The mass marches in the streets have made this incredibly visible. But the importance of working class power within this movement is really felt when we see things like unionized workers refusing to participate in transporting arms to Israel in a number of places in the world, including India. And just last week in Toronto, International Women's Day was marked, as it is every year, by a march. But this year, that march was led by the call for Palestinian liberation. And because International Women's Day in Toronto has been organized for decades by socialists and trade unionists, it has kept alive the real tradition of International Women's Day as a celebration of working women's history, the history of immigrant women's resistance in the textile industry. And because of this, the IWD march last week had big union contingents. And those unionists marched last week in support of women's liberation, but also chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." This is true of other movements as well. Unions and workers have to play a central role in the movement against climate change and the transition to good green jobs instead of the corporate profits that drive the use of fossil fuels. The rise of the far right and hate and the targeting of trans people, Muslims, immigrants, and refugees, all of these are fundamentally union issues and working class issues, as is decolonizing the Canadian state and supporting land back to Indigenous peoples. And today, in the midst of the cost of living crisis and the uneven cost of the pandemic on the most precarious work, we have seen the kind of workers' resistance that Marx and Engels were themselves inspired by during the Industrial Revolution in some of the most difficult workplaces to organize, places like Amazon. But we've also seen massive strikes in the white-collar public sector, the PSAC federal public sector strike, and the also massive Quebec Common Front strike just recently, where 20% of the Quebec population was on strike, and over 70% of those strikers were women. This gives the lie to the stereotype of the working class as blue-collar white men. And the strikes in universities, the one at York right now, and the almost strike at U of T, where academic workers joined forces in coordinated bargaining with maintenance and custodial staff and forced their common employer in the U of T administration to bargain with them at the same table, and they both won. Now, the next session in this afternoon is going to get more deeply into these contemporary struggles. But I want to say one final thing about what Marxism can teach us about revolutionary strategy today, and that is about organization. Marx and Engels were not just independent operators. They dedicated much of their lives to fighting for working class organization on an international scale, including by founding what became known as the First International of Working Class and Socialist Organizations. And although this wasn't easy, and they were involved in lots of difficult debates about political tactics and strategy, they knew that spreading revolutionary socialist ideas and activity required organization. And that is what organizations like the International Socialists are trying to build on today. We're the ones putting on this day school. But we're doing it in a variety of ways, and very importantly, by publishing a newspaper that we write and produce ourselves and distribute in neighborhoods and workplaces, on university and college campuses, in movements, through a website and social media, by being actively part of mass movements and making arguments that can help push them forward. But we're not here today, this event, to just admire what great thinkers Marx and Engels were. They threw themselves into the practical task of building revolutionary organization and the life and struggles of working people. And so must we do that if we agree that these powerful ideas of social change are necessary. Marx famously said that the philosophers have only interpreted the world, but the point is to change it. And I think those words, we have to really absorb what they mean, that change is not about changing just our own appreciation and thinking. It is about how many others we can convince to see themselves as the makers of their own history. Thank you.